He was the kind of man every woman admired. Brilliant, calm, untouchable. But behind that calm was loneliness, sharp enough to bleed through silence. He could explain the universe, yet not a single heart. This is the tragedy of intelligent men. They understand everything except love. It was a rainy afternoon in Copenhagen. Søren Kierkegaard sat by the window of a dimly lit coffee house, his notebook open, untouched for hours. He stared at the rain as though every drop carried a thought he couldn't catch. His mind was a maze, sharp, brilliant, but lonely. Across the room, a young woman entered, her laughter breaking the dull hum of silence. Her presence felt like sunlight entering a cathedral. She was curious, alive, unafraid of being seen. Kierkegaard's eyes lifted for a moment. Then, as if guilty of feeling, he looked back down at his notes. She approached the counter, ordered tea, and noticed him, the strange, quiet man lost in his world. Something in his stillness intrigued her. She walked over. "Do you always write in silence?" she asked, smiling. Kierkegaard paused. "Silence," he said, "is the only thing that listens." The woman tilted her head, amused. "And does it ever answer?" He looked up for the first time, really looked at her, and replied softly, "Only when we stop asking." She smiled again, not fully understanding, but feeling something stir. He didn't notice her beauty in the usual way. He noticed her presence, her mystery, and that frightened him. Days passed. She began to visit the coffee house often. They spoke about everything: God, fear, time, loneliness. She loved how deeply he thought. He loved how easily she felt. "Why do you think people fear love?" she asked one day. "Because," Kierkegaard said, "love demands surrender, and intelligent men never surrender easily." She laughed. "So intelligence is a curse?" "Only when it kills wonder," he replied. She leaned forward. "Then you must be dying slowly." Her words hit him like a mirror. For the first time, he realized she was not the student in their conversations. That night, Kierkegaard walked home through the fog, her words echoing in his mind, dying slowly. He thought of all the nights he'd chosen solitude over connection, logic over feeling. He entered his room, filled with books, drafts, and empty pages. He stared at his reflection in the window, the faint outline of a man who could write about passion, but could not live it. In his journal, he wrote, "The more I think, the less I feel. The more I understand, the less I belong." Perhaps wisdom is a slow form of self-erasure. He paused, his hand trembling slightly. What terrified him was not ignorance. It was the thought that maybe his brilliance had become a wall against love. The next day she waited for him at the coffee house. Hours passed. He never came. Kierkegaard sat at home, staring at a letter he could not send. He wrote, tore it apart, wrote again, tore it again. Each word felt too much, or not enough. "If I see her again," he whispered to himself, "I might begin to hope, and hope is dangerous." As rain tapped softly on the glass, he closed his notebook and whispered, "Understanding her means risking myself, and I am not brave enough. Not yet." Weeks passed. Kierkegaard avoided the cafe, yet the memory of the girl followed him like a whisper through the corridors of his mind. Every word she had said replayed, like a haunting melody. "Then you must be dying slowly." He tried to outthink it, to turn emotion into philosophy. He spent days writing essays about the nature of despair, about how man seeks God but fears love. Yet every paragraph felt hollow. At night, when the city fell silent, he would close his books and listen to the sound of his own breath. It frightened him, the sound of being alive. Because for a man who lived in thoughts, life itself had become a stranger. He wrote in his journal, "I have filled the emptiness with meaning, and in doing so, made meaning empty." The rain returned, gentle, constant, as though reminding him of the one thing he could not write away, the ache of what he did not feel. One morning he found her waiting outside his apartment. She held no resentment, no accusation, only a quiet smile. "You disappeared," she said softly. "I had to think," Kierkegaard replied. She raised an eyebrow. "And what did thinking tell you?" He hesitated. That thinking is my only safety. She laughed sadly. Then maybe safety is your prison. For the first time, he had no answer. She looked around his study, walls lined with books, paper stacks, no trace of warmth. You live inside words, she said, but who lives inside you? He turned away, his jaw tightening. No one, he admitted, and that is how it must remain. She stepped closer. You mistake detachment for wisdom, Soren. You don't fear sin, you fear surrender. Her presence felt like light burning through his armor. Before he could speak, she left quietly, leaving behind the faint scent of roses and rebellion. That night, Kierkegaard dreamed of a church with no doors. Inside, he saw her standing beneath the altar, surrounded by light. He tried to enter, but every step forward made the church drift further away. You think love is an equation, she whispered, but love is the proof that shatters logic. He shouted, then what is truth? Her voice echoed, truth without heart is just noise. He woke in a cold sweat, gasping for breath. The room was still, his books scattered, a candle flickering low. He pressed his hands to his face and whispered, God, why did you make the heart stronger than reason? For the first time, he envied the ordinary men. Those who could love without dissecting every feeling, who could surrender without philosophy. Days later, Kierkegaard stood by the lake, watching couples walk by. Their laughter felt like another language, one he had studied but could never speak. He picked up a small stone, tossed it into the water, and watched the ripples fade. That is me, he thought, a disturbance mistaken for depth. He returned home and wrote his most painful confession yet. Intelligence is not power, it is paralysis. The mind that understands all things learns to trust nothing, and in doubting the world, I have doubted love. The candle beside him flickered, then went out, as if even the light had grown tired of his thoughts. He closed his notebook. The silence he once worshipped now felt like punishment. Morning sunlight fell across Kierkegaard's desk, pale, cold, indifferent. He sat staring at a letter he had written the night before. It was to her, pages filled with regret, confessions, and the kind of tenderness he never dared to speak aloud. I do not know how to love without analysis, he had written, and in trying to understand you, I have dissected the very mystery that made you beautiful. He sealed the letter, but his hands trembled. He never sent it. Instead, he placed it in his drawer, among countless unsent words, silent apologies, and dead philosophies. He told himself, she deserves freedom, not confusion. But deep inside, he knew. It wasn't her he was protecting. It was himself. Weeks later, fate turned cruel. He saw her again, walking through a crowded Copenhagen street. Her laughter was lighter now, untouched by the weight of his thinking, and beside her walked another man, confident, warm, alive. Kierkegaard froze. His mind raced through every theory of love he had ever written, and every one of them collapsed. He didn't see philosophy, he saw life, raw, imperfect, and unreachable. The man whispered something that made her smile. A smile Kierkegaard once thought he understood, now realizing he never did. As they passed, her eyes met his for a brief second. She said nothing, yet her silence screamed, you overthought and felt too little. That night, his study became a battlefield. Books lay open, ink spilled across the floor. He walked in circles, muttering fragments of thoughts that contradicted each other. Reason, he said aloud, cannot comfort the soul. Faith demands surrender, but surrender feels like death. He stared into the mirror, a pale reflection of the man who once believed wisdom could save him. Was I ever wise, he whispered, or just afraid? In his journal he wrote, she has found in another what I tried to build in myself. Simplicity. Perhaps women do not seek brilliance. They seek presence. Tears fell on the page. He did not wipe them away. For the first time in years, he let himself feel, without translating it into theory. On Sunday, he walked to the old church. Empty pews, faint candlelight, echoing silence. He climbed the pulpit, though no one had asked him to. And there, he began to speak. Men build walls of intellect, he said softly, But women climb them with feeling. We chase the infinite, and yet fail the finite. We fear the touch more than the fall. We speak of faith, but cannot believe in the simple act of being loved. His voice trembled, breaking into whispers. Maybe God hides in the very emotions I've feared. Maybe love is not foolishness, but divine rebellion. He stopped, breath shaking. The church was still empty, but in the silence he felt heard. As he left, he whispered to himself, "She was my teacher, and I was too proud to learn." Autumn had returned, and the city had changed its color again. The same streets that once echoed with Clara's laughter now carried only the sound of wind against fallen leaves. Elias walked those paths alone, haunted by the rhythm of her absence. It had been weeks since he last saw her. She had stopped visiting, stopped writing, stopped waiting. At first, Elias told himself that silence was simply another language, that her absence was a test of meaning, a riddle to be solved. But deep inside, he knew it was not a riddle. It was a decision. One evening, he passed by the cafe where they first met. Through the window, he saw Clara sitting with someone else, a man who laughed easily, who didn't weigh every word like it was a philosophy. For a moment, Elias felt the familiar urge to analyze, to ask why her laughter sounded different, why her eyes shone with light. But something inside him broke instead. He turned away, whispering, "She has learned what I never could, how to live without thinking of every wound." That night, Elias sat by the candlelight and wrote a letter, not to be sent, only to exist. "Clara, I used to think love was a dialogue between two souls, but now I see it was a monologue of my mind. I questioned everything, even your warmth, even your silence. You gave me life and I turned it into theory. You gave me a heart and I returned with an analysis. Maybe it's true. Intelligent men don't lose women because they stop loving. They lose them because they cannot stop thinking. I never understood you, Clara. And maybe understanding was never what love required." He folded the letter and placed it inside his journal, under the same line he once wrote months ago. "To understand love is to destroy it." Now, for the first time, he wondered if he'd destroyed himself too. Weeks later, Elias found himself in a small chapel on the outskirts of the city. He wasn't praying, just sitting in silence. An old woman beside him noticed his trembling hands. "You've lost something," she said gently. Elias gave a faint smile. "Someone, perhaps. But more than that, I've lost the ability to love." The woman studied him, then said softly, "No one loses that. They only bury it under pride and fear. You've built walls with your thoughts, and now you mistake the echo for the truth." Her words pierced deeper than any philosophy. For the first time, Elias didn't have an answer. He only bowed his head, as if surrendering to something beyond intellect. One morning, Clara came to return his book. Her face was calm, her presence light. No anger, no sorrow, only peace. She looked around his room, the papers, the journals, the candle half burned, and smiled sadly. "You never changed anything here," she said. "I was waiting," Elias murmured. "For what?" "For you," he replied, the words breaking like glass. She shook her head gently. "I waited too, Elias. But then I realized waiting for you meant waiting for someone who lived inside his own thoughts. I wanted to be seen, not studied." He tried to speak, but his throat tightened. "I don't hate you," she continued softly. "You just love differently. From the mind, not the soul. And I needed warmth, not wisdom." She turned to leave. As the door closed, Elias whispered into the emptiness, "And I needed mystery, not logic." He finally understood. She hadn't stopped loving him. She had simply stopped waiting for him to understand love in her language. That night, Elias didn't write in his journal. He just sat by the window, letting the candle burn until morning. For the first time, he allowed the silence to exist, without analyzing it. The silence, he realized, was her final gift. The morning after Clara left, Elias woke to a stillness that felt different. Not peaceful, but hollow. The walls seemed to breathe with her absence. Every object reminded him of a conversation that never reached its truth. He walked through his apartment like a stranger wandering through a museum of lost meaning. The books he once worshipped looked lifeless. The notes he had written, hundreds of pages on love, logic, and desire, now felt absurd. He opened his journal and read one line aloud. To think deeply is to love purely. He laughed bitterly. No, to think too deeply is to kill what's pure. He shut the book and threw it across the room. For the first time, Elias, the philosopher, the thinker, the man who always had words, found himself unable to write. It was as if language itself had abandoned him, just as Clara did. Elias began wandering the city aimlessly. He no longer went to lectures or cafes. The places that once filled him with ideas now felt haunted. At a small bookstall, an old man recognized him. "You're Elias, aren't you? The one who speaks about truth and the soul?" Elias smiled faintly. "Used to." The man nodded. "And now?" Elias looked away. "Now I think truth is just an excuse, a beautiful word we hide behind when we can't bear to feel." The man stared at him for a long time, then said quietly, "Be careful, son. When a man loses faith in love, he soon loses faith in life." Those words followed Elias like a ghost through the evening. He sat by the riverbank, watching the current move freely. No thoughts, no rules. He envied it. For the first time in his life, he felt something close to despair. Not the poetic kind philosophers write about, but the real one, the kind that eats slowly from within. Days turned into weeks. Elias stopped eating, stopped reading, stopped writing. His apartment gathered dust. His candle burned down to wax tears. One night during a storm, he stared at his reflection in the window. His eyes were hollow, his beard unkempt. He looked like a shadow of his former self. In that fragile hour, something broke. He screamed, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. He tore through his journals, ripping pages, scattering words that once meant everything. "All these thoughts," he shouted, "and I still don't understand how to love." He sank to the floor, surrounded by the fragments of his own mind. The candle flickered, wind seeping through the cracks. And in that silence, he realized, this was the collapse he had always feared. He had built a fortress of intellect to protect himself from pain. But now that fortress had crumbled, and all that was left was feeling. As dawn arrived, Elias sat in the debris of his thoughts. No more anger, no more questions, just stillness. He looked at a single torn page on the floor, Clara's name written beside a quote he once loved. "The heart has its reasons, which reason knows nothing of." He whispered, Pascal was right. The heart knows first. The mind only follows. Too late. He felt tears for the first time in years. Not the proud, restrained kind, but raw, cleansing ones. At that moment, he realized something powerful. All his intelligence, all his theories, had been a defense, a way to control life so it wouldn't hurt him. But love, he now saw, was meant to hurt, to humble, to dissolve the ego. He had always studied love as an observer. Now, for the first time, he experienced it as a human. That morning, Elias walked out of his apartment and left his journal behind. No notebook, no pen, only the silence of a man who no longer wanted to define life, but to live it. As the sun rose, he whispered to himself, "The collapse of the thinker is the birth of the soul." Elias walked through Vienna at sunrise. No books, no notes, no purpose. For once, his mind wasn't racing to name everything he saw. The morning light touched the cobblestones with a quiet glow, and for the first time in years, he noticed how beautiful silence could be. He passed a small flower stand where a young girl was arranging tulips. She smiled and offered him one. He hesitated, then took it, without analysis, without meaning, just acceptance. She asked, "Would you like a ribbon?" He thought of his old self, the man who would have asked why ribbons exist, what they symbolize, what they mean. But now he simply said, "Yes." She tied it around the flower and said, "It looks happier now." Elias smiled. "So do I." He walked away holding the tulip like a small miracle. Fragile, temporary, alive. In the following days, Elias began living slowly, intentionally. He started helping at the bakery below his old apartment, carrying flour bags, cleaning tables, and greeting customers. The baker, a warm-hearted woman named Greta, noticed the change in him. "You used to talk like a priest," she laughed. "Now you listen like a friend." He smiled gently. "I used to think listening was about understanding. Now I see it's about being present." One afternoon, he watched a young couple argue, then laugh moments later. He realized something profound. Love was not logic. It was movement, rhythm, chaos, and harmony in the same breath. And for the first time, Elias didn't try to define it. He simply admired it. The dance of contradictions that once terrified him. That night, he wrote a single line in a new journal. "To live is not to explain. It is to feel." A week later, while walking by the river, Elias saw Clara. She stood alone, holding a sketchbook, drawing the water's ripples. She turned, and for a brief electric moment, time stopped. No words, no resentment, just two souls who had traveled through different storms to arrive at the same quiet shore. Clara broke the silence first. "You look different." Elias nodded softly. "I stopped thinking so much." She smiled, the kind of smile that carried both pain and peace. "So, you finally learned to feel?" He exhaled slowly. "No, I finally stopped running from it." They sat together by the river, not as lovers, not as strangers, but as witnesses of each other's growth. For the first time, their silence felt complete. That evening, Elias returned home and began writing again. Not essays, not theories, but reflections from the soul. His handwriting was slower, freer. He wrote, "There is no greater wisdom than tenderness. The mind creates walls. The heart creates bridges. I once thought love needed understanding. Now I see it only needs presence." He looked out the window. The same city, yet everything felt new. The people walking below weren't symbols or studies. They were living mysteries. He smiled, whispering to himself, "The rebirth of feeling is the death of pride." That night, Elias fell asleep with the window open. The sound of rain filled his room, soft and alive. A lullaby for the man who had finally stopped dissecting the world and started belonging to it. He didn't dream of ideas or theories. He dreamed of hands, warmth, and laughter. The raw texture of being human. And as the rain fell, it washed away the last traces of the man who once believed he could think his way through love. The morning light crept through the curtains, touching Elias's desk, now scattered not with philosophy books, but with pages of heartfelt reflections. He sat there quietly, his cup of tea untouched, his gaze distant. The once restless philosopher now looked still, peaceful. He picked up his pen and wrote, "The mind seeks clarity, the heart seeks connection, and the soul seeks surrender." Outside, the city was waking. Carriages, footsteps, laughter. For years, these sounds had distracted him. Now they comforted him, like a heartbeat of something he had long ignored. Life itself. He whispered, "Perhaps truth was never hidden. I was just too afraid to live it." Later that day, Elias took out an envelope and began writing to Clara. Not out of longing, but as an offering of closure. "Clara, I once tried to understand you as a philosopher. I now see how cruel that was. You were not a riddle. You were a reflection. You showed me what I feared most, to feel deeply, to lose control, to be human. I no longer wish to explain women or love or God. I only wish to honor the mystery that lives in all of us. You once said, 'You can't love from the head.' You were right. Thank you for teaching me what my books never could." He sealed the letter but didn't send it. He smiled softly. The letter wasn't meant for her. It was meant for his former self. Months later, Elias was invited to speak at a small university. The hall was filled with young students eager to hear the philosopher who vanished. He stepped up to the podium. No notes, no references, just his presence. He began quietly. "For years, I thought intelligence meant control. I believed that understanding something gave me power over it." He paused. The audience leaned in. "But women, life, love, they don't want to be controlled. They want to be met. The more I tried to define love, the more it disappeared. And the day I stopped defining it, it began to breathe. He looked across the hall. Young men and women, some taking notes, others lost in thought. What you know about women, he said, is only a reflection of what you allow yourself to feel. If your heart is small, your understanding will always be shallow. A soft murmur filled the room. Some students had tears in their eyes. Intelligence is nothing, he concluded, without tenderness. The hall fell silent. For once, silence didn't demand to be filled. It was full already. That night, Elias walked home under the stars. The world felt light, not because it had changed, but because he finally had. He returned to his apartment, sat by the window, and opened his journal one last time. He wrote, "The truth is not found in knowing women, but in loving them without fear. To feel deeply is not a weakness. It is divine courage. The mind dissects what the heart embraces. I was a man who thought too much of God to love his creations. Now I see God hides in every woman's eyes, in every human heart brave enough to feel." He set the pen down, exhaled, and closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, Elias felt whole. Not brilliant, not wise, but alive. The camera lingers on his desk. The tulip from the market, now dried yet beautiful, rests beside his last page. He searched the heavens for meaning, but found it in the eyes of a woman. In the end, intelligence could not save him. Only love could. Because the greatest truth of all is that what you know about women means nothing until you learn how to feel.